Good morning. My name is Jared Genser, and I'm the founder of Freedom Now and serve as international counsel to Siamak and Baquer Namazi, two American hostages imprisoned by the government of Iran. Each were convicted and sentenced in October of 2016 to 10 years in prison on charges of collusion with an enemy state in reference to the United States of America. They're being held by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran's notorious Evin prison. I'm joined here today by Babak Namazi, who is Siamak's brother and Baquer's son. We urge the government of Iran to release Siamak and Baquer Namazi immediately and unconditionally on humanitarian grounds. And we call on President Donald Trump, who in October of 2016, commenting on the Namazi's convictions and Iran having taken two more hostages, said, quote, "This doesn't happen if I'm president," to be good to his word and to do whatever is necessary to secure their release from prison. Babak and I come to Vienna today in a dramatic moment of escalating tensions between the United States and Iran, because it is here, later today, that the Trump administration will have its first face-to-face meeting with Iranian government officials on the to discuss the implementation of the Iranian nuclear deal. We understand that the United States will be raising the ongoing imprisonment and mistreatment of the Namazis during the discussions with Iranian officials, which is why we came all this way to be here. In our press conference this morning, I will provide some context for the Namazi cases. Babak Namazi will then speak about his family's situation, and I'll discuss our filing made earlier today to the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention against the government of Iran before opening up the floor to questions. By way of some background, although U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson last week certified to the U.S. Congress that Iran is in compliance with its implementation of the terms of the Iranian nuclear deal, he announced a cross-government review of Iran policy grounded in a scathing indictment of how Iran's policies are adverse to the interests of the United States. Secretary Tillerson described Iran as the world's, quote, leading state sponsor of terror. He indicated that Iranian naval vessels harass U.S. naval vessels operating the Persian Gulf, that Iran has conducted cyber attacks against the United States, that its development of and proliferation of missile technology is in violation of relevant Security Council resolutions, and that it continues to have one of the worst human rights records in the world. And he concluded by saying that, quote, an unchecked Iran has the potential to travel the same path as North Korea and take the world along with it. Buried among the broad array of concerns to the Trump administration was reference to Iran unjustly imprisoning American citizens. And yet, if unresolved quickly, the Namazi cases could have an outsized impact on the trajectory of U.S.-Iran relations, because both are in rapidly declining health. Secretary Tillerson's remarks followed the Trump administration sanctioning both the Tehran Prisons Organization and its head on April 13th. In commenting on those sanctions, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer noted, quote, the sanctions against human rights abusers in Iran's prisons come at a time when Iran continues to unjustly detain in its prisons various foreigners, including U.S. citizens Siamak Namazi and Baquer Namazi. He added, quote, we join recent calls by international organizations and UN human rights experts for the immediate release of all U.S. citizens unjustly detained or missing in Iran so that they can return to their families. We are here today so that Babak Namazi can provide a voice for his father and brother and speak to who they really are and what their family has been suffering through in what will shortly be some 2 years. Before I turn the floor over to Babak Namazi, I want to conclude on a personal note. As an international human rights lawyer, I have been privileged over many years to represent and help secure the release of dozens of people who have been victims of arbitrary detention around the world, including Nobel Peace Prize laureate Aung San Suu Kyi. In all of these cases, the prisoners and their families suffer enormously. But what Babak and his family are suffering through with two loved ones in prison is beyond anyone's capacity to imagine. Babak, your courage, grace, and dignity with which you and your family are handling the most impossible of circumstances and is an inspiration to me and to my team. And we will stand in solidarity with you and advocate relentlessly for your father and brother's freedom until the day comes that they are both released and able to return to all of you.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Jared. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I'm here in Vienna today as a desperate son and brother to bring to life for the international community and to put human faces onto the enormous suffering of my dearest father, Baquer Namazi, and my brother, Siamak Namazi. I am here today because I fear that unless something is done quickly, I may not see them again, ever. I am here as it is my duty, as the only able son and brother, to do all I can for those dearest to me in my life. Baquer and Siamak Namazi are Iranian Americans who have each been unfairly arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years in prison for collaborating with the hostile government of the United States of America. They're being unjustly detained in Iran's notorious prison by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. It would have been an unimaginable nightmare to merely have 2 members of my family be hostages of the government of Iran. But my family's suffering has been compounded by the intense, unrelenting, cruel, and inhumane treatment imposed on both of them, such that today I do not know if they will still be alive in the coming months. I beg the government of Iran to release Siamak and my father on humanitarian grounds. It's enough. Please let them go. They are completely innocent of the charges on which they have been convicted. They are patriots who love both their countries and who have only ever wanted to improve relations between the people of the United States and of Iran and help the Iranian people. It causes my family unrelenting and enormous pain to see how their bodies, minds, and spirits have been crushed in Evin prison. But despite all of the cruelty that we have witnessed, it is not too late. I urge the Iranian government to step back before my father or brother, or both of them, die in their custody. All the signs suggest, as I will describe in much greater detail, that this is an outcome whose likelihood is increased by the day. Not only would my family be devastated and inconsolable, but this result would, I fear, escalate an already fragile situation between the United States and Iran, thereby also driving our peoples further apart in the process. Ironically, both my father and brother have spent their lives trying to foster mutual cooperation and understanding between our people. I am here in Vienna today because it's the first day of bilateral discussions between the Trump administration and the government of Iran regarding implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, or the nuclear deal. But that is not the only item that will be discussed on the agenda. I have been told by the Trump administration that the United States will directly raise the ongoing unjust imprisonment of my father and brother to the Iranian government. I was very encouraged to hear this, just as I was encouraged in October 2016 to hear then candidate for President Donald Trump, in response to Siamak and my father's wrongful conviction, say, "This doesn't happen if I'm president." I am counting on the president to take personal responsibility for the lives of my father and my brother, and to act urgently in the face of their rapidly declining health and welfare. As I noted earlier, Siamak and my father are being detained in Iran's notorious Evin prison, in a wing under the exclusive control of the Revolutionary Guards. This prison is infamous for its systematic use of torture and degrading treatment, and the special wing where my father and brother are being held is known to operate outside the law and with no semblance of transparency or legality. Even the judiciary system has no control over their actions. We have been told by the judiciary they have issued instructions to move Siamak to a better cell and to allow my father and Siamak to see each other more often. These instructions are, however, disregarded with impunity. My brother Siamak has experienced the worst of Evin prison in the 18 months that he has been detained there, and for reasons beyond comprehension, singled out for even harsher treatment. He has been continually subjected to lengthy interrogations, which have persisted even after his conviction. He is held in a dark, humid cell that lacks even a bed to sleep on, and he is forced to sleep on a concrete floor. And most of the time in that cell has been spent in solitary confinement. The Revolutionary Guards have, to my horror, tortured, tased, and beaten Siamak, in addition to subjecting him to psychological torture. It seems that they're doing everything they can to push Siamak over the edge, and in recent months, it is clear that they are succeeding. The suffering intentionally inflicted on Siamak, combined with his extended isolation, have caused his mental and physical well-being to deteriorate rapidly. He went on a hunger strike at one point and has lost more than 12 kilograms while in detention. He is severely depressed, and even more so since his conviction. The few conversations I have been able to have with Siamak scare me to death and keep me up at night. He feels that he has nothing to live for, and taking of matters in his own hands, which he repeated again a few days ago. Every second of every day, I fear the worst. I fear the worst will happen to my family. Meanwhile, our father Babak Namazi is 80 years old and has serious heart conditions, and has also been put in solitary confinement for part of his detention. Prior to his detention, he had undergone a triple bypass surgery and was having regular follow-up appointments with a heart specialist regarding arrhythmia. He was taking a half a dozen medications a day for his various ailments and was told that he may need a pacemaker. Now he is completely cut off from his own doctors, and we have no idea what medications they are giving him in prison. It is incredibly rare for the Revolutionary Guards to allow a detainee outside of the prison for medical treatment. And so it is especially telling and heart-wrenching for me that they have rushed my father to an external hospital on 2 separate occasions, each for some 5 days. My family and I were not informed at the time and only heard this through my father after the fact. The doctors have refused to provide their diagnosis to him, instead only briefing the Revolutionary Guard handlers after he has been removed from the room. None of us have ever seen his medical records from such external hospital visits, but we do know from his own rapidly expanding list of self-observed symptoms, including severe weight loss, dizziness, exhaustion, confusion, lightheadedness, and shortness of breath, that time is not on his side. His body, mind, and spirit are visibly wasting away, and the change has become even more pronounced since his unjust conviction. Prior to that, he could still put on a good face in front of his family, even finding the strength to laugh at the absurdity of it all. But now his spirits have been crushed by the harsh reality that although he is innocent, he may well die in prison, and soon. It broke my heart when my father recently asked me, and especially my children, to pray for him. With the brave face he has always put on for my brother and me as he traveled the world for UNICEF, he always appeared to be able to bend the world to his will, in small but important ways, for the betterment of humanity. While my father always believed that prayer was compelling and important in its own right, for him to ask me and his grandchildren to pray for him was his way of telling me that he has accepted his fate and that it is out of his hands. I cannot describe how such physical and mental deterioration of my hero crushes me. Let me now step back for a moment and explain the events that brought us to this point. My brother Siamak was arrested by the Revolutionary Guards on October 13, 2015, following 3 months of intense interrogations. He had been visiting Iran for a weekend trip at the time for a family funeral in July 2015 and was prevented from leaving by the Revolutionary Guards. Following his arrest, he was immediately taken to Evin prison and subjected to relentless interrogations regarding his ties to Western institutions and efforts in easing the reach of life-saving medicine to Iran. We could not understand what the Revolutionary Guards wanted to do with Siamak, a business consultant and scholar who had never sought to antagonize the Iranian government. We hoped that this arrest would prove to be some kind of mistake, and he would soon be released. In fact, within days of Siamak's arrest, the magistrate who issued Siamak's arrest warrant told me personally that Siamak will be released within weeks. With this private assurance, my family initially decided to keep quiet and not to speak with anyone about this situation. But when it became clear that this commitment was not going to be honored, a member of our family reached out to the U.S. State Department on November 15, 2015, and conveyed unequivocally that our family wanted the State Department's help in securing Siamak's release from prison. In January 2016, both Iranian and international news outlets started reporting that Iran would be releasing 4 American hostages as a condition of the impending nuclear deal. My family was overcome with joy over this news. There was only 4 known American hostages in Iran, and at that time, Siamak was one of them. Excuse me. He was going to be released, and in fact, Siamak's inclusion in the release list was initially reported by both Iranian and Western media. But on January 16, 2016, Iran released 5 American hostages, and Siamak was not one of them. It turned out that there had been 2 other unknown hostages, bringing the total count of American hostages to 6. And Siamak had been to her shock and horror left behind. My family and I were devastated, and we struggled to comprehend how President Obama could leave Siamak behind, let alone leave us to learn about this in the media, rather than reaching out to us in advance. We were about to put out a press release expressing our dismay and shock, but it was highly recommended by the State Department to keep quiet. I was informed that Secretary of State John Kerry had secured a promise from Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif that Siamak would be released within weeks, and our issuing a statement could interfere with achieving that outcome. So, wanting the best for Siamak and not wanting to create any obstacles, we acceded to the State Department's request. Foreign Minister Zarif broke his promise, and looking back, I am mystified as how Secretary Kerry could have trusted him to do so. Not only had the United States unfrozen and reportedly returned considerable sums of Iranian assets, but the entry into force of the nuclear deal was done. So, where was there any incentive for the government of Iran to release Siamak? I have never been given a satisfactory answer to that question. Even worse, not only was that promise broken, but weeks later, horrifically, the Revolutionary Guards doubled down by arresting my father. My dear father is an 80-year-old retired UNICEF officer who has dedicated his life to helping the world's most vulnerable children. After a lifetime of service in some of the most dangerous areas in the world, he deserves to be living out his retirement in peace. Instead, he is suffering and dying in an unimaginable hell. On October 17, 2016, in an extraordinary perversion of justice, my father and brother were unjustly convicted of collaboration with a hostile government, referring in this case to the United States. They were each sentenced to 10 years in prison. For my father, this amounts to a death sentence. As the end of President Obama's term approached, there were more frequent direct discussions with U.S. and Iranian officials on a range of topics, including the American citizen hostage cases, in particular my family's. But on January 20th, 2017, the clock ran out. While President Obama and Secretary Kerry were able to leave office, return to their own families, and enjoy their retirement from public life, Their legacy is having left my brother and father behind in Evin prison. I stand here today, however, to remind the government of Iran that it is not too late to release Siamak and my father on humanitarian grounds. It is urgent that this happens before we are faced with a tragedy that would be devastating not only to my family, but also to U.S.-Iranian relations. I also want to convey to President Trump that I'm counting on him to be good on his word, that the government of Iran will not be able to detain American hostages on his watch. I ask that coming from the discussions today, that President Trump decides to act, and he acts urgently. While I'm grateful for the public expressions of serious concern and that the cases are being raised today privately, it is not enough to demand the release of my father and brother. I urge the Trump administration to open an appropriate channel with the relevant parties in the government of Iran to enable direct and ongoing discussions to secure the release of my father and brother. Time is running out fast. To those of you who are gathered here today, thank you for bearing witness to my family's suffering. My final request is to you. Please keep the story alive, because my father and brother's lives depends on it. Time is running out. Thank you.
Babak, thank you for your incredibly moving words, which of course speak for themselves. Before I open up the floor to questions, let me speak briefly about the legal filing that we made earlier today in Geneva. As counsel to the Namazis, my team and I lodged a formal complaint against the government of Iran before the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. The working group is a specialist quasi-judicial body that was created by the former UN Commission on Human Rights and whose mandate was extended and continues under the United Nations Human Rights Council. It consists of 5 independent experts appointed by the Council. And although the experts serve in their individual capacities and not representing their respective governments, members of the working group currently come from Australia, Benin, Latvia, Mexico, and South Korea. According to its methods of work, upon receiving a complaint, the working group provides a government up to 60 days to respond to the submission. The petitioner is then given the opportunity to reply to that response from the government. And ultimately, the case is typically considered during the next triannual session of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and a written legal opinion is adopted and published, determining whether or not the person or persons in question are being detained in violation of a country's obligations under international law. While there's no enforcement mechanism for opinions of the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, in my experience, combining such opinions with political and public relations advocacy can be a highly effective tool to pressure governments to resolve outstanding cases of arbitrary detention. The government of Iran is, for example, well known to engage with the working group and very much does whatever it can to try to avoid being condemned by the United Nations. In our submission, we detail how the Namazis are being detained, both in violation of their fundamental rights and in violation of their basic rights of due process of law, protected by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, a treaty to which the government of Iran is a state party. For example, we explain how Siamak Namazi is being held in violation of his right to freedom of association, as the entire case against him seems to be about his associations with Western organizations, including the World Economic Forum, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. We also detail a wide range of due process abuses that demonstrate unequivocally the arbitrary nature of their arrest, trial, conviction, sentencing, and ongoing imprisonment, as well as their conditions of detention. The violations that we describe in much greater detail in our submission to the UN include the Iranian government arrested the Namazis without a proper warrant. The Iranian government held the Namazis for extended periods without charge. The Iranian government has, for extended periods, held the Namazis without access to their family. The Iranian government has failed to provide the Namazis with an independent and impartial tribunal to adjudicate their cases. The Iranian government has failed to provide the Namazis with a public hearing. The Iranian government interfered with the Namazis' right to prepare a defense, to call and examine witnesses, and to cross-examine witnesses against them, as well as to have withheld all evidence from the defense. There was no valid evidence of any kind to justify finding the Namazis guilty of the crimes with which they were charged. The Iranian government interfered with the Namazis' right to the presumption of innocence. The Iranian government substantially limited the Namazis' right of access to counsel. The Iranian government substantially limited the Namazis' right to an adequate appellate review according to law. And the Iranian government's ongoing denial of medically appropriate detention conditions constitutes cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment as well as torture under international law. All this said, however, the charges against the Namazis were clearly pretextual. In fact, they have been imprisoned as hostages to be used by Iran as leverage in negotiations with the United States. I want to conclude this morning by reaffirming the call that both Babak and I have made during our discussion today. Again, we urge the government of Iran to release Siamak and Baquer Namazi on humanitarian grounds immediately and unconditionally. And we call on President Trump to do whatever is necessary to assure their release in short order following today's discussions here in Vienna.
I'm a little bit confused on a kind of side issue here, which is nonetheless important. I think you say that this is the first meeting of the Iranian and U.S. delegation at the JCPOA review talks. These review sessions have been ongoing for more than a year, so can you specify what is special about this particular session in this aspect?
Yeah, sure. So the last JCPOA meeting took place in early January before the inauguration. And so the reason why this particular discussion is different is because it's the first discussion of the JCPOA taking place post-inauguration of Donald Trump and post-Donald Trump taking a very different approach to U.S.-Iran relations. And so, of course, the JCPOA itself is the EU plus one, the P5 plus one, plus the EU and Iran. And while much of the discussion today will be multilateral in nature, there, of course, will be a bilateral segment between the United States and Iran, and it'll be the first time that Trump administration officials will be meeting with the government of Iran directly.
And you've been assured that the U.S. Delegation will be bringing this topic.
Yes, a senior official at the White House assured us of that, and that was reaffirmed in our discussions with the U.S. Department of State. Shadia?
Shadia Nasrallah, Reuters news agency. I'd be grateful if you could tell us a little bit more about the medical situation. So we know he's had a triple bypass. Can you tell us a little bit more about what kind of treatment your father would need, you think, and what he's not getting, and if he's also suffered from weight loss or other obvious physical symptoms apart from dizziness that you know about?
I mean, the problem is absolute lack of information. I don't know what treatment my father should be receiving or not receiving. What I do know is that he's been hospitalized on two separate occasions while he's been imprisoned. I know he's had a serious heart condition, the triple bypass surgery. I know he's lost 12, 14 kilos of weight, and all the signs that we see are worrisome. I know that he's been told in the past that he may need a pacemaker. So obviously the concern we have for his health is, number one, is he getting the proper medication that he's supposed to be getting? Number two, is he being diagnosed and treated for any ailments he's facing? I'm obviously extremely worried that what has happened, that my father has been transported to the hospital outside of Evin prison. As I'm sure everyone can imagine, this is not a location that they would like to send anyone out of. So it's the unknowns. I'm worried that his continued weight loss, his complaints about his well-being and health are serious signs of his continuing deterioration and threatening his life, really.
And I would also just add, we are not aware of what's going on with him because he has not been provided any medical records or any diagnosis by any of the doctors that he has been brought to see. So even though he was hospitalized most recently for 5 days in January, he was given no information by his doctor that was treating him there as to what was going on with his health. In fact, the only people to receive that information were representatives of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps that were present. One of his most recent visits with his doctor, he was told that his situation is getting worse by the doctor, but the doctor wouldn't specify what that meant or how that might be responded to. And so in order to understand what kind of treatment he needs, we need to first understand what's going wrong with him. It's clear that from the external factors of his symptoms as described, including in much more detail in our submission to the UN today, that his situation, just by his own observation, is getting worse. And from looking at him physically and watching him deteriorate day by day, that he is in very bad shape and the situation is getting worse. I would emphasize, I think it is important to emphasize that a number of people have asked us, are we concerned about the escalating rhetoric between Iran and the United States? Are we concerned about the Trump administration's approach to Iran relative to President Obama? And what I would say about that is that we actually don't have any real idea right now what impact the new relationship between Iran and the United States is ultimately going to have on the negotiation process for the Namazis. However, I think it's important to understand that in our view, something happening to the Namazis would be devastating not just to one side, but to both sides. So if you are the government of Iran, it would be my view, if you believe that President Trump is looking for any excuse to take a hardline position on the wide array of policy issues in which the US and Iran are at odds, that for the Revolutionary Guards to potentially be responsible for the deaths of either or both of the Namazis would provide broad justification for President Trump to respond with a wide array of punitive measures. And for President Trump, who spoke out publicly and unequivocally about the Namazi cases, was harshly critical of President Obama's negotiations of the nuclear deal and of the deal itself, and said that if he were president, that Iran would not be allowed to hold hostages American citizens. For either or both of the Namazis to die on his watch would be a public and catastrophic failure of his negotiating skills, and would of course have a devastating impact on one American family. And in light of these realities, we really very much hope that both Iran and the United States understand that the best outcome here would be for a swift and unequivocal resolution of the Namazi cases and that of the other American political prisoners. Sorry, we're good next. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, please.
Do the Namazis have legal representation in Iran? And what kind of access, if they do, is there to their legal representation?
Given the kind of obvious sensitivities of anyone operating on the ground, I don't want to speak in much detail about that. Let me just say generally that yes, they have legal representation, but that it's well known globally and by both reports of governments and independent human rights organizations that the judiciary in Iran is neither independent nor impartial, that the numbers of lawyers that are even allowed to represent people accused of crimes such as collaborating with a hostile government is exceptionally limited, and that there is, given there is no independence of the judiciary in Iran, that the decisions that have come out first from the trial court were not independent from that of the executive branch of the government. And although the Namazis had their appeal recently in March, there's no expectation based on past experience that there's any reason to believe that such an outcome from those appellate decisions would be grounded in the law and in the facts of their specific case. So there really is no remedy that is available domestically. Ultimately, this is a situation that really is going to have to be negotiated, in our view, by direct contact between the governments of the United States and Iran.
There are upcoming elections, presidential elections in Iran. Here, the Iranian delegation is headed by Mr. Araghchi, who is working for the actual government. I'm not sure if they are re-elected, the president, and they are in charge in the next months after the end of May elections. And from the other side, we know that the Pasdaran is not controlled by the government. They didn't answer to the government. Negotiating with Mr. Araghchi about the release of Namazis has any sense?
Look, it's not for us to tell either the government of Iran or the government of the United States who the appropriate interlocutors might be to discuss the potential release of the Namazis. What one can point to from the release that took place in January of 2016 is the fact that there were a range of actors taking credit for the Iranian side's negotiation, competing with each other, actually, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, as well as the Ministry of Intelligence. Who was actually responsible for making this happen is a question that one can speculate about. What's quite clear is that if both governments are serious, they will be able to find a way to find the right interlocutors to have the kind of discussions that are necessary. And so our view is that the raising of the case today before the bilateral discussions between the United States and Iran at the JCPOA meetings is not an end in and of itself, but merely a beginning, and must be the beginning of a process by which there will be then ongoing discussions through some kind of private channel where both sides can determine who they want their interlocutors to be and can talk with each other. And ultimately, it was quite clear from the reporting that came out from our good friends in the media, such as yourselves, in January 2016, that the United States was fully capable of identifying the right interlocutors that would actually have the authority to be able to achieve the outcome that was achieved in January of 2016. And I have no doubt that if the administration, the Trump administration puts its mind to it, that it will find the right interlocutors and that they will be able to rapidly expedite discussions on the situation of the American hostages. Let me just lastly note, though, that there are obviously a lot of very thorny and challenging issues in the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Iran, and we're here today to emphasize that the humanitarian imperative of securing the release of the Namazis and the American hostages in Iran, in our view, should be put on some kind of a parallel and independent track from the much more complex issues in the bilateral relationship, and that one should not require a resolution of the broadest range of issues in the U.S.-Iranian relationship to be able to secure the release of the Namazis. In fact, unless President Trump follows through on his commitment that this is not going to happen if he's president, as he said, American hostages, and works aggressively and directly with the government of Iran, the Namazis are going to run out of time. Their health and welfare is deteriorating rapidly, and we're very, very worried that unless aggressive action is taken from today by both sides, that we're going to run out of time. And so this is what, of course, we're here today to do, is to urge both governments to come to the table rapidly. And as I've explained a moment ago, we believe that there should be a strong interest on both sides and from all elements of factions within Iran and the Iranian government to want to resolve this case now rather than to end up in a situation in which decisions are going to be forced on all sides that will be against the interests of Iran and the United States. All right, well, thank you all for coming today. We really appreciate your coming out this morning to hear what particularly Babak Namazi had to say, and thanks again for the ongoing and strong coverage of this important story as part of the broader question of U.S.-Iran relations. Thank you.
Thank you.